Let me start by welcoming you all to come here on our voyage through the history of North Kingstown. As you probably all know, we've picked 1 month for every village, and October is Allenton month. And we're really pleased to be able to talk about Allenton. I've set up here, it's a different sort of mill village. It's a great place. And we also have one of Allenton's biggest features is Elm Grove Cemetery. And we have a great walk scheduled about 2 weeks from now in Elm Grove Cemetery. So I hope you'll all come to that, because it's just a really fun, informative walk, and there's some amazing stories that we can learn from that location. So I'll be looking forward to seeing you all there as well. Today we're going to talk about Allenton, the village itself, and it's a great place. I have a lot of personal connections to it, so it's something that kind of I have always had an interest in, and as we move forward through the story, I'll talk about some of my own personal connections. But Allenton is interesting because it's a mill village for sure in some respects, but it doesn't have really, except for a short while, it never had its own actual mill within the confines of what we might define as Allenton. For a while there was a small mill, and we'll use our Rhode Islandese here, located where Ray's is now, pretty much. But that mill was very small, and we'll talk about that. But it really existed through necessity and opportunity, as a small village has all of a sudden found a niche for itself in being a support village for all the large mills that were within walking distance of Allenton Center proper. And we'll talk about all those as well. I mean, Belleville Mill, which was up Oak Hill Road, was a massive mill. It nearly rivaled the Lafayette Mill. And down the way we have two mills operating in tandem throughout most of their career, the Silver Spring and Shady Lea mills. So with those three mills and the Narragansett Mill, which is actually in Allenton, this one mill village really served as the service community for 4 different mill village communities. So the people who worked at these mills all used Allenton as the place that they would go to the store and go to church and do all the kinds of things that you need to do in a mill village. The schools were there. Everything was there in Allenton. So it's unique in that respect. It's not as simple as Hamilton or Lafayette or Davisville, where the textile mill that it is centered around was smack dab in the middle of the village. Allenton was different in that it was really a support village for a good amount of mills that were all very well nearby. And again, a lot of these talks I've talked about how the American spirit of entrepreneurship kind of drove people, and that's what happened here. The people in Allenton realized that they were in a situation where they could benefit by supporting all the textile mills nearby. So out of necessity and opportunity, Allenton grew without its own textile mill. So this is a great image that tells us something about Allenton, because what this is the Allen family homestead. Charles Allen, who was related, the Allens have been in North Kingstown since the very beginnings of North Kingstown, even before there was a North Kingstown. But they were a family that was centered in Quidnesset when they began. And South Quidnesset, which of course we now has been kind of swallowed up by the Davisville-Quonset Point area, but they were there, and in 1790s, Charles Allen moved down and had this great house that you can see here. This is on the corner of a road in Allenton, and take a good look at the detail there, the fence. There's Mr. Allen standing in front of it, those great granite posts, and you'll be able to then begin to see how this was the center of Allenton and how it relates to Allenton today. So here are those same posts, the same location, and in the background, of course, we see a place we all love, Carriage Inn, and it's embedded in the middle of that Carriage Inn is a stone barn, which unfortunately did not show up on the picture of the Allen family homestead. That stone barn was something that the Allen family used as a kind of a trademark for the kind of work they did, because in the period of the 1700s, the Allen family were both stone masons and stone merchants. They built things out of stone, and they also sold building stone and construction stone all up and down the Narragansett Bay. And indeed, Judge John Allen, who lived in South Quidnesset and has Allen's Harbor named after him, had a ship called the Seaflower that was specifically designed, a big, wide, well-built ship with a very narrow draft that he used to haul building stone up and down the Narragansett Bay and across even over to Newport and Bristol. So that stone barn there is a calling card for them. You know, this is the kind of stone we have. This is the kind of work that Allen stonemasons can do. Now, the house that we saw before served the Allen family for a century or more. It eventually became a restaurant called Old Acres, and then eventually it burned down, and the restaurant business was transferred into the stone barn, which is the roots of the Carriage Inn that we see today. It's an interesting place, and all sorts of owners there have done their darndest to say there's ghosts in it. I don't know if there are or not. But, you know, it's a great advertising ploy. But if it is a ghost, it's probably one of those Allens walking around saying, you guys aren't respecting my stonework well enough. But, you know, it really is the center of that. And those, you know, you can see today, and it's so wonderful over the years that the various owners of this piece of property have maintained that great detail work. As you can see, the gates, the walk gates, and all the curbing that the Allens had there proudly to show what they offered and what they could do are still there to remind us of the reality that this is the roots of Allenton, this very location. He came down here in 1795. He bought a great big parcel of land, and that's the beginnings of Allenton itself. So we talked about Allenton as growing from this little teeny place. A member of the Allen family of the next generation opened a small kind of country store in the location. And really that was all that was there for a while. It was just one of those places that people would just drive by in the Boston Post Road. A little bump in the road, if nothing else. But once all these textile mills began, things began to change in Allenton. So let's take a look at the 4 textile mills that really served as the impetus for the expansion of Allenton into something more than just a crossroads, but into a full-fledged village. The first one we're going to look at is the Belleville Mill, which existed until 1960. There may be some people who will remember this place. I do as a small child, but it was, as I said, it was an impressive mill, and equaled in size and in number of employees the folks same amount as what was in Lafayette. This was right on Lafayette Road. We're right now looking across Secret Lake towards the Belleville Mill, and Oak Hill Road is right in front of it. So you're driving down Oak Hill Road. As you pass the area where the fish ladder is there, that's the old control gates for water from Secret Lake going into the Belleville Mill. By this time, that location was both of those man-made ponds were feeding this one mill. It was so big. But milling actually began here in 1790, about the same time the Allens were coming down here. 2 gentlemen who were from Patuxent Village up Warwick Cranston way, Christopher and William Rhodes, came down here and began the process of damming up these 2 streams that ran through here and intersected the Shiwatuck River and the stream that came out of Swamp Town, Goose Nest Brook, and they formed together into a river that was then called the Anaquatucket River. At this location, these 2 brothers dammed both of these rivers as they came in and put up a couple of industries there. On one side, they had a sawmill, and on the other side, they had a grist mill. They operated together there for quite some time until they decided to sell out in 1830. So the Rhodes brothers were here working, sawing wood and grinding up corn and grain for local folks at this location. And they began the process of taking these streams and the associated wetlands that were around them and turning them into the two wonderful ponds that we have today. Belleville Pond and Secret Lake are just beautiful assets to the community. And when I do tours of these locations on foot, I like to point out to people, especially high school kids, because they're the ones who would have been doing all the work, that these are man-made ponds. And that's one thing we need to think about when we talk about the kind of water features we have in North Kingstown, the fresh water features. By and large, every single one of them, other than Carr Pond, is a man-made pond. They were made for these milling industries. So when you take a look at Secret Lake, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, or Belleville Pond, and look at the size of them, the depth of them and everything, think about the effort in the 1700s and early 1800s that it took, with no tractors, no excavators, just people with shovels and draft animals drawing blades across the land there to pull the muck out, to turn them into ponds, cutting down the trees and everything that would have been involved in taking these two basically streams and turning them into what really amounts to, if you think about it, is storage batteries for power, for industry. Goes back to your old physics classes, kinetic energy and potential energy. Potential energy is stored in those two ponds, and the kinetic energy was when they ran over the dam and turned the water wheels. So people put a lot of effort into creating these two ponds so that they could run industry at that location. So the Belleville Mill worked in the textile trade from 1830 until the 1960s. The two wooden mills that were built by the Rhodes brothers burned down in a fire in 1856, and then a gentleman named William E. Pierce came into the area too and constructed this massive brick mill there and began utilizing it to weave woolen fabrics there. And again, it operated in this capacity that we see here for nearly a century. Hundreds and hundreds of people, generations of folks, walked across the threshold of this place every day to work in the textile mill at Belleville. They lived all around the area and in Allenton, up and down Oak Hill Road, and were parts of this community. It was, as I said, a huge operation that ran for quite some time into the 1960s. This is the Silver Spring Mill, and the picture is interesting for a number of reasons. Of course, the mill is gone, and this is, if you can all think about you're driving down Colonel Rodman Highway, Route 4, towards Wakefield, and the Silver Spring waterfall that's there along the side on the west side of the road as you drive down. A beautiful location. One of the state's best fishing ponds, stocked all the time. It's really a wonderful place for young people to enjoy freshwater fishing because of the work the state has done there to make it into a beautiful location. Well, it too had its origins in the milling business, and this picture here is interesting because it shows the mill that existed at that same location throughout about the same time frames that the Belleville Mill operated. If you look past the mill itself, you can see some buildings up the road. Those buildings are all still there, but the textile mill building itself is long gone. Now, this road that we're seeing here in front of the Silver Spring Mill, now we call it Pendar Road. Probably everybody remembers Pendar Road or recognizes it. But at that time, Pendar Road was part of the Boston Post Road. There was no Pendar Road. There was no Colonel Rodman Highway. There was no Route 4. There was actually even no Tower Hill Road until you got up to the southern intersection of Shermantown Road and what we now call Tower Hill Road, because the old Boston Post Road ran through here, ran up Pendar Road, went to Shermantown, headed east until it intersected with what we now know as Tower Hill Road. And that section of the road from this location onto where it intersects with Shermantown, Tower Hill Road again, was all created in the 1930s as part of what I like to fondly call the great widening and straightening of all South County roads to move people down to the beach. And Pendar Road was then cut off, and it was then named Pendar Road after Pendar Z. Gardner, Ezekiel Gardner, who was the word Pendar or Pindar means pound keeper, and he was a pound keeper, an animal pound keeper, who would had an animal pound that stray animals, he would capture them and hold on to them until someone claimed them, and if no one claimed them, then they were his. But this is the way that the roads in North Kingstown and South County all look, just a quiet dirt road. And right above the word Silver Spring, you can see a dirt trail. That is the trail that would take us over to Shady Lea. And again, there was no Tower Hill Road there, so these were all very rural roads that connected all these textile mills together. So here's the Shady Lea Mill, also a beautiful location. And then both of these mills date way back. Silver Spring, the work began there in 1762. The Taylor family purchased them. And these two mills were run by interrelated families, the Taylors and the Sanfords. They were born together by marriage, and they operated these two mills in tandem in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Joseph Taylor began the Silver Spring Mill and was one of the earliest folks to get into milling in the location. Silver Spring was created in 1762. This Shady Lea Mill was a little later, and it was built by the Sanford family, who the Taylors married into, in 1820. The Silver Spring Mill is interesting. It began, and the textile milling is really how the Industrial Revolution played out in South County. That's really what we had going on down here, and the Industrial Revolution within textiles was something that progressed through time as we had the technology to mechanize the making of fabrics, going from what's on a sheep's back to having a sweater or a jacket. People jumped in, again, entrepreneurs who said, we can make money off of this. We can do something special for our family. And at the time of the late 1700s, the only kinds of things that could be mechanized were things that were called fulling and carding. So he ran a fulling and carding mill at that location in the late 1700s. Now, carding is when you comb out wool. People would come by there with their wool from their sheep after they sheared them, and rather than card it by hand in a labor-intensive process that usually was done by women and daughters in a house. And all of these industries must have been great. Mothers and wives must have been happy as could be when these things started out, and when they said, especially when we get to fulling, which you'll find even more interesting. You don't have to sit there all night long carding wool to get it all cleaned up and ready to be spun. So you take it there and have your stuff carded, and then you would take it home and spin it by hand until the technology advanced to the point where they had spinning mills. But at this time, they didn't have that technology. So you would take your wool over to Mr. Taylor, and he'd have it carded for you. And he got paid not with money, but with what was called the keep. He got to keep a certain percentage of that wool for himself. He could sell it, he could give it to his wife to work with, but that's how that stuff worked out then. And whatever, if he's keeping 10% of it, once it was all carded and ready to be spun, he'd give it back to you, and off you'd go home and spin it. And then, you'd have to weave it in your house too, and you'd have a piece of wool fabric. And as you know, wool fabric is itchy, it shrinks, it's tough to work with. But it's great if you can have it felted, and that's what a fulling mill is all about, taking a piece of wool and felting it and turning it into a nice, soft, already pre-shrunk piece of fabric. When you felt something, the fibers in the woven material all bind together. You can cut it. It doesn't unravel. So a felted piece of wool is a wonderful thing for a housewife to work with to make clothes for her family. But in the 1700s and early 1800s, there was the process for felting fabric was a difficult thing. You had to have a chemical that you could utilize to break the fabrics down, the fibers of the woven wool that you wove in your house on your loom. So then you could hammer it and bind it all together and then heat it up and shrink it, and then you're all set. The chemical process that they used was using animal urine. So think about the process. You just made yourself a nice piece of fabric, and then you go out in the backyard, get a fire going, get yourself a nice iron kettle full of nice boiling animal urine, and stick it in there and stir it around and let it cook so that the urea in the animal urine will break the fabric down. You got to watch it. You got to make sure you don't do it too long. You got to take it out. You got to rinse it, and then you have to take it over and beat it on a rock or something until the fibers all bind together, and you have a woolen fabric turned into a piece of felt. And of course, again, this is stuff that wives and daughters did. So when we were able to mechanize felting fabric with a fulling mill, where the animal urine would be in a factory, and there were machines that would hammer the hot fabric to get it to break down and bind together. Every housewife in South County was happy people. I mean, you can imagine sitting on the side of a rock with a warm piece of fabric that just came out of a boiling pot of animal urine and trying to beat it until it gets like felt. So we have to give a lot of credit to women in this time frame we're having to do this stuff. But I imagine that every woman in South County, when Mr. Taylor opened up his felting mill, said, guess what? You're taking the fabric there. I'm not doing this anymore. It's an interesting thing to think about. But again, it's part of the process for the getting to a point where making some clothes, making a bolt of fabric, which went through all these steps in houses all across the United States and all across England and Europe at the time frame, and be able to do it in a factory. And that's really what the Industrial Revolution was all about around here. So these mills were doing that. Eventually, as technology went on, the Taylors and the Sanfords, two families that were willing to take a risk. I mean, if you're just a farmer and you've got a good piece of property with a stream on it, and you find out all about these new technologies that are out there, these new opportunities to begin a new life for yourself, there's investments and there's risk involved. These are some of the many families who said, we're going to do this, we're going to jump into this. This is the future. And it's funny because, that's life now. People take risks, financial risks. They look at what's out there and take risks for their families. So the Silver Spring Mill eventually became a mill where they were weaving woolen fabric, and then the Sanfords, who had come along and married into the Taylor families, took the same technology in 1830 and constructed the Shady Lea Mill, which is still out there to this day as a nice artist colony. All of these mills at the time frame, as we get into the period of the 1800s, were involved in the same kind of industry that most textile mills in South County and southern Rhode Island were in as well. A portion of what they were making in their factories were a niche industry that existed here in South County. It was pioneered by the Rodmans and the Hazards here in this area, and the Davises, who realized that they don't have a big enough storage battery. The pond at Shady Lea here, for instance, is not going to compete with the giant rivers that existed in Massachusetts and Vermont and Connecticut. They didn't have the power to compete with the giant broadcloth mills. So they wanted to find a textile niche that they could occupy and do well with. And that niche ended up being the Negro goods trade, where they were making fabrics, lower quality fabrics that were specifically marketed to the South for plantation owners, and after the Civil War was over, for landowners who had sharecroppers on them. And they marketed this fabric. If you look at old maps and old magazines from the 1800s about this area, you'll see all these textile mills will say they're making a fabric called Kentucky jean. And Kentucky jean was a marketed fabric that was created are made here in South County for that purpose, to be durable fabric that was sold to southern plantation owners, to be made into slave clothing. And all of these textile mills that we're talking about today, a certain percentage of their output was indeed for the Negro goods trade. It's a sad part of our story, but it's an important part. It's important that we all think about it and realize that this occurred here, and it's just part of the bigger story in Rhode Island, where so much of Rhode Island's history is, sadly enough, tied into slavery. So Shady Lea and Silver Spring are chugging along in the 1800s, making textiles for Negro goods trade, and also, they have a line of clothing to be sold locally as well. That wasn't the only thing they were making, but they were doing that as well. When the Civil War came up, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. These textile mills, along with the other mills in the area, got a lot of contracts to make wool blankets and horse blankets for the Union Army. And eventually they were able to make winter uniforms for the Union Army. And indeed, those contracts allowed Robert Rodman, who was running Lafayette, to have enormous amounts of resources. And during this time frame, Robert Rodman, who was then already running the Lafayette Mill, took the money he made from the contracts that he got for these Union worn stuff that they were making here, and purchased both the Shady Lea and the Silver Spring Mill, and ran those as part of his larger empire based in Lafayette. Now, the Narragansett Mill, which is the only one that was in Allenton proper, is gone and replaced by, there's a pond next to Ray's, and Daniel Drive runs through the property by the Anaquatucket River, where the water was gathered to run the mill. But we do have this house to remind us of the Narragansett Mill. This is right on Tower Hill Road, just before you get it to its intersection with Oak Hill. It's a house built for Joseph Sanford. And Joseph Sanford's an interesting character, and he's kind of representative of what was going on in the time frame where the 1700s were turning into the 1800s, and folks who were farmers or going to sea were thinking about the opportunities presented by the Industrial Revolution and the textile industry that was beginning to spring up in South County. Now, Joseph Sanford was a sea captain, along with his brother Esmond Sanford. They both had their lives, their work lives, their financial well-being tied into going to sea. But when they saw the opportunities that were presented here, they decided to take a risk. Joseph has a house on Brown Street in Wickford that looks almost exactly like this house. And he lived there when he was a sea captain, but when he got into the textile industry, as you know, going to sea is a hard business on a man. And when he got to a certain point, where back in the early 1800s, you're considered past your prime for going to sea once you reach your 40s, if you've been doing it for 20 or 25 years. And he was at that point, so he wanted to get into a new business. His wife loved the house in Wickford, and when he moved out here, he had an identical house constructed to make her happy with the move. And the only difference between this house on Tower Hill Road and the Wickford house is the wraparound porch that exists on it. It's a great house, and it's, as I said, right across the street from where the Narragansett Mill used to be. So again, this location here by Daniel Drive is another one that had gone back to the 1700s, similar to the Silver Spring site. 1700s, it was a sawmill and a grist mill at the location, and when Sanford bought it, he transformed that location using the power of the Anaquatucket River to run this small textile mill he had here. At the very same time, his brother Esmond was doing the same thing just down the river, about another half a mile on the road that we now call Featherbed Lane, where he built a textile mill there as well, and the ruins of it still exist today. And these two brothers operated their textile mills in tandem, worked together, and they would work on contracts, fabric contracts together, and these two mills were connected by a cart trail that ran through the woods, which part of Daniel Drive is actually part of that cart trail. And when I was a kid, you could walk all the way from Featherbed Lane down that old road and end up in the back of Ray's, where somebody from Ray's would yell at you and you'd have to go back home. But, and at that time I didn't understand that, but that's the story with these two textile mills. And again, for a matter of scale, both of these mills were very small. Eventually, the Esmond Sanford's mill on Featherbed Lane was bought up by the folks who owned Hamilton Mill. Not so much they wanted to use it, but they wanted to make sure they controlled the water rights, because if somebody downstream of the Hamilton Webb textile mill controlled the water, then they controlled the future of Hamilton Webb. So they bought that mill for the water rights, and eventually Robert Rodman purchased the Narragansett Mill along with the same time that he had purchased Shady Lea and Silver Spring. So Allenton itself, this is a scene as we enter what would folks back in the day, if you were going to go back 150 years and say, take me to Allenton, here you are on the Boston Post Road in the beginnings of Allenton, which really began at the location where the Narragansett Mill was, pretty much, where we end up where the Anaquatucket River crosses Tower Hill Road, and Daniel Drive is there today. Just past that, these homes would show up. And as you can see, they're at this point, and this is towards the very end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century, these are all houses that you can tell by the style of them that were for mill workers. People probably at this point who were working at Belleville Mill just up Oak Hill Road. And what's kind of neat about Allenton is it hasn't changed much. It's kind of been off, often it's not a place where there's a lot of commercial interest in it, so much of Allenton stays exactly the same. So if we take this exact same shot and we take a picture of it today, this is what we end up with. Now that probably looks familiar, and all those buildings that were in the previous shot are pretty much still there. So, that's more than a century, 125 years later, almost no difference to as we enter Allenton as we're moving south down the Boston Post Road. We just go a little bit farther. Now we're looking past where Ray's is, and we're there near the intersection of Oak Hill Road. And this is, again, on the Boston Post Road in midst of Allenton. We see one of the 4 stores that sprang up in the Allenton area as all these textile mills expanded. And the funny thing about these particular mills is they didn't really have large mill stores attached to them. And I really think that's because at their peak, most of them were owned by Robert Rodman, other than William Pierce, who owned the Belleville Mill, and they all realized that they didn't have to provide that. They had the reality was that as long as they supported the village of Allenton, and indeed they did, Pierce and Rodman both made investment into the village of Allenton, that would satisfy the needs of their workers to have stores and churches and social places and schools. So Pierce and the Rodmans invested in the village, and it sprang up. So at this point you have 4 different stores, where typically in a mill village you've got one mill store, mill company store that's supplied them. And you can see that one right there, which is on the corner of Oak Hill Road. And it indeed ran there for quite some time. And what's kind of neat about that building is that it is the very first location where one of the Belleville mill workers, an Irish immigrant who came here after the potato famine, got his foot in the door here in in North Kingstown, worked as a mill worker for 15 years or so, and decided he wanted to get out of the mill business and strike out on his own. Another great adventure in the entrepreneurial spirit that kind of makes America what it is. And his name was Michael Ryan, and he decided he would rent that building right there and open up a market called Ryan's Market. And he started out there and ran this Ryan's Market right in that building right there until he saw an opportunity to move into Wickford, and the rest, as we might say, is all local history. But that little building right there was the beginnings of Ryan's Market. And again, many of these buildings, if we jump ahead 125 years, you see small buildings on either side that are mill workers' housing as well. And we see the continuation of the fence of the Joseph Sanford House, and there's the building that Ryan's Market began in, sitting there today on the edge of Tower Hill Road in the middle of Allenton. And we're talking about stores. Let's move on to the biggest and most successful and longest running store in Allenton. The Lafreniere General Store. When I was beginning to study history in the area, I just made an assumption that the Lafrenieres, and of course I knew this store. I went there as a kid to this place. I'd lived on Inniquatucket Road at that time, and I'd get on my bike with my friends. I had this big, giant, cumbersome bike because I had a paper route with the baskets on the back wheel, and all my friends had cool bikes. But we still rode down there, and inside a Lafreniere's General Store, and I know there's people here who remember that, there was this soda machine that you could get there. It was a chest kind of a soda machine, and the sodas were all in this ice water, in the ice bath all the time. It was the coldest soda you could drink in all of North Kingstown, and all us kids would ride down there, and I remember, to this day, I can remember the feeling on a hot August day of going into the store and looking at whatever Lafreniere was there at the counter and going over and just rolling up my sleeve and ramming my arm down in there to get the coldest root beer you could ever have, and then going out and sitting on that porch with my big ugly Raleigh bicycle with the newspaper racks leaned up against the porch and drinking that soda. And I'm sure there's people here in the audience who have that memory, and I know there's people all over town that do. So it ran for an incredibly long time. And so I just thought that this was as a kid, I just thought about the store. But when I get into being a historian, I thought about the building, and the building is pretty substantial. I made an assumption in my mind that the Lafrenieres must have run a boarding house too. And I operated on that assumption for quite a while, and so I really started looking into the history of the building and talked to descendants of the Lafrenieres who are still around town to this day. And I learned that they did not run a boarding house. They were just really, really good Catholics. And all of those rooms on all of those floors was just chock-a-block full of Lafrenieres. And, and the story about the building, and you may have noted now that something's happening at the store. I don't know if folks have driven by and seen something. Somebody else has bought it, and they're going to, make it into something and fix it up. So it's exciting to think about this building having possibilities. But the Lafrenieres were great people and great members of not only the Allenton community but all of North Kingstown. There's so many Lafreniere stories out there that you could go on and on about it. It was just a great place, and a store that ran from 1892 until probably 1979 or 1980, run by Lafrenieres the whole time frame. They weren't very good with their wills, though, and up until just a little. The reason that nothing ever happened with it because the building, and all of it was listed in the heirs of Rosalie Lafreniere. Now, I think Rosalie Lafreniere died in 1902, and they never settled the estate. So, in the end, this wonderful Catholic family, the few remaining Lafrenieres that were here had to pay lawyers oodles of money to track down the many, many Lafreniere descendants that were out there and get them all to sign off on doing something with this building. And it says something about the Lafrenieres because they cared so much about this place, and not really, none of them said, no, I'm not going to let you. I want to cash out. They all got together. They all signed off on it because they found had a buyer who was willing to save the building, to make it restored and be a kind of a testament to the Lafrenieres and their future. So again, there's the building. And today there's no difference other than the fact that at some point they put a upstairs porch on it so more Lafrenieres could get out and get fresh air. But it's a great building, it's a great story, and it's an critical part of the story of Allenton. We move down the road again and we get to another building. Okay, this is the original site of Charles Allen's son William's general store that he put in here in 1857. The Allens were taking advantage of the situation, knowing that things were going on with the mills, and Allenton was prospering, and the Allens were still there living in the Allen house that we looked at, and he came down here and built a small store here. It's not this one, though. They worked here and ran this store here, and once Allenton had enough people, it became a post office, and it got its own postmaster, and of course that postmaster was William Allen. Whoever ran this store was also the postmaster. So this became, as you can see by the sign here on the Allenton post office, and it really, again, post office were great back then because people had to go there. You didn't get mail delivery, so everybody would have to go to the post office to pick up their mail. So there became places where people gathered socially and meet each other at the post office as you're seeing if you have any mail, and talking it up with each other, and it became a gathering point in the village. One of the village centers, old timers would sit out on the steps and wait to see who was going to come and who was going to go at the post office, and it was just a big part of the community. The smaller post office was replaced in 1896 by a post office and a store that was largely constructed with monies provided by the Rodman family. And again, by then, the Rodmans owned the Shady Lea and Silver Spring Mill and the Narragansett Mill, and as I said, William Pierce owned the Belleville Mill, and they all wanted to invest in Allenton, so they didn't have to invest extra money in their mill locations, and in some cases, like Belleville, they didn't have a place to put these kinds of things. There just wasn't enough space. So this bigger store was constructed in 1896 with monies partially provided by the Rodmans. At that time, it was run by the Wilbur family, and it was called Wilbur's General Store. And then through a bunch of marriages, women of these families married men, and the store's name changed from the Wilbur family. One of the daughters of Walter Wilbur, who ran it, married a gentleman in the Kingsley family. And eventually, a couple generations later, Kingsley ran it for a while, and then a woman from the Kingsley family married into the Zarafinitis family, and eventually all these three families ran this store, taking it over from the Allens originally. And these three families have a long history in the Allenton area, and even towards the end, I went to school with the daughter of the last of the Zarafinitises that ran a store here. So it operated as a country general store, which were the kinds of things that were all over New England until supermarkets came along and put them all out of business. But it still operates to this day, and we take this picture up another 100 years or so, 125 years, we end up with the convenience store that's there to this day. And again, as you can see, little has changed. The building is remarkably the same as it was. If we go back, we can see 125 years, like most of the buildings in Allenton, it's like a time capsule. Little has changed there. In the back of the building, you see a barn that was built by the Wilburs and Kingsleys. That barn actually served the community again when there was a fire at the Allenton Baptist Church. That barn was utilized and offered up to the members of the Allenton Church as a place so they could hold their services. So again, that spirit of community played out even in the respect where a shop owner was willing to reach out and support the church and the community. And next you have the Montessori School in Allenton. Beautiful building. It's a really fine looking school, and it operated as a school for the town of North Kingstown until about 1960. And then it was eventually became the Montessori School. But at that time it was called the Allenton District Schoolhouse, and it was one of the bigger schoolhouses in North Kingstown. And when we operated in schools as district schoolhouses, I mean, the other locations did not have a building as big as this. And this reflects the reality that there were so many textile mills operating around Allenton, and there were just, a lot of families with a lot of kids, and this is twice the size of most of the district schoolhouses that existed during the day. I mean, if you get a good example that's still around for us is the NK Food Pantry on School Street. That existed as the Davisville District Schoolhouse. It's substantially smaller than this one, and it really was pretty typical for the size of a district schoolhouse in not only North Kingstown, but any small South County community in the period of times when the communities ran district schoolhouses. And so Allenton's schoolhouse, as big and beautiful as it is, not only reflects the realities that there were a lot of families working in all these textile mills, but again, that the Rodmans and the Pierces wanted a district schoolhouse that reflected, their commitment to the community, because the district school system operated differently than the school departments of today. At that time, the town would give a small stipend to each district schoolhouse, say school district, say $500, and say, this is all we're giving you. You people live in this district, you raise the money, you find a way to pay a teacher, you build a suitable schoolhouse, you staff it, you run it, you maintain it. So if you were in a place like Allenton and you had some deep-pocketed benefactors like the textile mill owners that were here, you got a school that was as nice as this as compared to some of the very simple one-room schoolhouses that other places that were just populated by farmers could ever begin to afford. There's some pictures of classes at the Allentown School. This is a typical year. Charles Crombie, there's the teacher. Again, Charles Crombie is interesting to me. He was a highly educated man, went to school at the Washington Academy, lived in Wickford as a boy, and he was hired here because they were able to pay him well at this schoolhouse because of the benefactors that they had in Allenton, helping to pay for the school and helping to subsidize the salary to get a really good teacher here. So, Charles Crombie, who eventually left teaching after a while and went back to Wickford and opened up a drugstore in the village. But at that time frame, he's here as a highly educated man teaching the children of Allenton. Now, before that school was built by, funded by monies from the mill owners, there was a smaller school that existed at the southern intersection of Hamilton Allenton Road and Tower Hill Road. This picture is thought to be of that school. A smaller group of students, as you can see, and a smaller building, but the necessary expansion to the bigger school had occurred from this small one-roomer type schoolhouse that was at this southern corner of Hamilton, Allenton, and Tower Hill Road. Because of the influx of folks that came in, particularly at Belleville, as it expanded dramatically and brought in, at that time, Belleville and Hamilton were both expanding quite rapidly, and there just weren't enough local workers around to support them anymore, and they began to reach out to different communities, French Canadian, particularly in Irish communities, and bringing people into North Kingstown to work there to keep those mills humming. And you got a real influx of people who were not from around here, who even in the instance of the French Canadian kids who maybe weren't even really proficient in English at this point, and they benefited by having an educated man like Charles Crombie working at the school. Every village, mill village, had a social hall, some place that they could go and do things in a time frame well before what happens today in America, where everybody goes home from work and turns on some kind of a tube, whether it's a small thing in their hand or something, and stares at it rather than doing what is now obviously considered to be crazy, is to go and talk to people. But back in the 1800s and early 1900s, that's what people did at night. As crazy as it sounds, they would actually go out and get together and talk to each other. And every mill village had a social hall. And this was the Allenton Social Club. It's now the Knights of Columbus Hall. It's a picture of it at present day, the Knights of Columbus Hall building. But these are the kinds of places that were vital to the social network of communities like Allenton or any other mill village. The places where you went to have your ham and bean dinner, or you would get together and have a Christmas party with mill workers, or you could rent it out and maybe that's where your daughter got married, or all the other kind of things that might happen. In the day before movie theaters were prevalent, there were people, other entrepreneurs who drove around through small communities like this with some films and a projector, and would set up shop for a week and show movies in these places and move on to the next town. So those kind of things happened here, along with dances, and this was an important part of the community. Again, funding for these kind of things was from the community, but also, again, from those mill owners that we talked about. Here's a great dance card from a dance in February of 1914 at the Social Club, Allenton Social Club. You'll see it's benefiting the Nurses Association of Wickford. It had fallen apart. I got it, and you can see half a hole on either side. It used to be together, and that hole was where there was a string through it, where there was a pencil, where every little girl who went there, every teenage girl or 20-year-old woman would go there and, as you can see, fill your dance card with who you're going to let dance for each of the dances. And it's a pretty neat little artifact from a time long gone by, that I was given by someone who actually had it filled out. And one of these dances, she said, "Well, I actually eventually married one of these guys," but that's the kind of things that happened in the Allenton Social Club, was these kind of dances that went on and were something to look forward to in a small community like Allenton. Now, the Allenton Social Club was also involved, the organization that ran in the time frame, in what was called Allenton Old Home Day, once a year, and it was a big thing. Once a year they had Old Home Day that went on in the 20th century, and people would come from wherever they ended up moving and coming back to Allenton. Again, as I said, we have 3 large textile mills here with hundreds of workers that went through the doorsteps of each of those mills across generations. And they had a connection to Allenton. Eventually they moved on and went somewhere else, but when Allenton Home Days came by, they would all come back and celebrate Allenton. They'd all get back together And there was a party of sorts. They had a fair there. They had gatherings. They had performances by the people who lived in Allenton at that time to commemorate the history of Allenton and all that sort of stuff. And this kind of stuff happened for many, many years. Allenton Old Home Days. This happened, and we'll use our Rhode Islandese again on the big field that is now occupied by Mike's Auto Body and what used to be Tarbox, but is now owned by the Department of Environmental Management. This big field was the location for the Allenton Old Home Days, and every year this was a huge event that people all across New England looked forward to and came down to rejoin with old friends that had their roots in Allenton. It's another photo of another section of the fairgrounds where Allenton had its fair each and every year. And again, it was a huge event and showed up in the local papers. It was something people really look forward to, and something that's largely forgotten at this point. Of course, another big feature in Allenton is, of course, Elm Grove Cemetery. Set up on an old farm that was there in 1851, and it was a community effort. But also, Allens were involved in the creation of Elm Grove Cemetery, and they all got together and decided that the community finally needed to have a cemetery that would be used by everyone. Prior to this, burials were on in the family plot on the old farm. But the world was changing with the Industrial Revolution. The same people weren't staying in the same house for generation upon generation to take care of the old family plot. And all across the United States, places like this were opening up to take the responsibility away from people who felt badly. I mean, think about it. If you're a young couple and you've inherited the farm that your great-great-great-grandfather started, and all those generations are buried in the backyard, and you just can't stay anymore. You have to sell and move to somewhere else. You feel pretty bad about leaving those folks behind and leaving them untaken care of. So that was the impetus for community cemeteries like Elm Grove. And indeed, Elm Grove is interesting because some of those families said, well, we're selling this, but before we do, we're going to do what we should do for our ancestors, and they were all relocated into Elm Grove Cemetery. Some of the plots are completely family plots from the 1700s that were reinterred here in Elm Grove because the families decided they had no interest in leaving them unattended, because it did happen pretty regularly, especially on family farms. And when somebody new buys it, they don't care about those folks. They care about grazing land, for instance, and they lay the stones down flat and let them grass over and let the cows feed on them. So people had seen that, and that's not what they wanted. And Elm Grove is one of the places that sprang up to take care of that. And here we can see from this picture from the turn of the century why it was called Elm Grove. The streets were lined with beautiful elm trees, just like the streets in Wickford were, but all those elms succumbed to the elm blight in the 1920s, 1930s, and all passed away. So Elm Grove has no elms, but it's still an active family cemetery.
Where is it?
It's right on Tower Hill Road, probably pretty much across from Oak Hill Road as you go down there. There's a picture of it today. Now, that's where we're having our talk in about 2 weeks. And again, it's a huge cemetery. There's well over 10,000 souls buried there, and they not only are the people who tell a story of Allenton, but all of North Kingstown and much of South County. The history of all of that can be kind of it exists here in Elm Grove Cemetery. It's quite a place, and again, cemeteries are interesting. Now it's not a place anybody goes to, and I'm a undertaker's son, so I spent lots of times in cemeteries, but cemeteries were designed to be places for people to go. They're designed to have beautiful grounds, and back in the day, even in the time frame that I've been alive in, people would go there and have picnics and go and tend to their ancestors' graves and walk the beautiful lanes and gather with other families. they were social gathering places, and now they truly are ghost towns because, in our time frame, people, for some reason, they don't ever go there. Once you have buried your loved one there, you never return, and it's a different mindset than what occurred in the 100 or so years before. And this is a gentleman who has a part in the next story we're going to talk about, Allenton, and he's Elder William Northrup. Elder William Northrup is an interesting character. He's a local guy, and he's probably one of the biggest connections that I have to Allenton. He's interesting because the Cranstons and the Northup married so much that I'm related to this guy 3 different ways. He's a couple of my grandfathers and one of my great uncles, so it's pretty amazing. For a period of time from the 1760s to the 1820s, every marriage between a Northup and a Cranston, every generation had a Northup Cranston marriage that went on in it. They were really critical. And Elder Williams Northup, his sister was married to my direct ancestor Thomas Cranston, and these 2 couples, along with 12 other couples, formed the Allenton Baptist Church. It started out meeting in a location on Boston Neck Road, but eventually settled at its present location in a small church that was there before the one that's here. And in the end, this is an interesting story from my childhood because this is a stone in the Cranston family plot, and that's Elder William himself. And I didn't know about the connections when I was a teen, even when I was in my 20s, and I always wondered, why are these Northups buried here? There's 3 gravestones that encompass the story of 8 different Northups, and of course some of the women are actually Cranstons, I found out, and they were all buried at the site of the Allenton Baptist Church until it was expanded, and they looked to find a place to relocate Elder William to, and he and his brethren and his children and his wives, and they all, the Cranston family said, well, we're kin to them, move them over here, and that's how they ended up in my family graveyard. Of course, this is their church today, and again, Elder William was buried here until this larger church was constructed. After they were moved from their Boston Neck location, they settled here at this location and built a small meeting house here, which was eventually replaced by this church, and which has been expanded over the years to be the church that it is today. And it served the community, as I said, mill villages typically have to have a house of worship. And some of the people who worked here probably went down into Wickford and maybe went to the Episcopal Church, and who knows, some of them eventually, as time went on, especially after Belleville was constructed and French, Canadian, and Irish folks were going there, would have walked down to St. Bernard's Church. But this really has been the spiritual center of Allenton through all the years, and it's actually the 4th oldest congregation in North Kingstown area. The first congregation was also a Baptist church, which is the 6th Principal Baptist Church on Old Baptist Road, then followed by the old Narragansett Church and the Quaker Church in Wickford. The Quaker Church, of course, is no longer there, and then this church. So this is a very old congregation, has been around for a long time. And Elder William Northup was the leader of this church for 57 years, giving his last sermon, which he was carried into because he couldn't walk anymore a week before he passed away, and he served this church as its spiritual leader for 57 years, so he's quite a guy in that respect. But the church still goes on today and ebbs and flows, but it's an active, vital congregation right now, and it's doing a lot of wonderful things at that location. So finally we get to a picture that shows us the end of Allenton. As proper. And if we're looking at this, we're just a little bit north of the location that we saw with Silver Spring Mill. You look at that stone wall off to the side there. That stone wall is the stone wall that is now filled with folks trying to plant grapevines there to open up a vineyard. That field is that same field, and just off this picture is the last of the big structures that were part of Allenton, which are those Rodman barns that are now being turned into that vineyard location, built by Charles Rodman. And this whole farm was run as a part of the Silver Spring Shady Lea textile mill conglomerate. And the farm that was here was a farm that fed the people of not only Allenton, but also of Lafayette as well. So farm produce and dairy products and eggs and such that were produced here on the farm were the kinds of things that went into the bellies of mill workers from Lafayette all the way down to Silver Spring and Shady Lea. And again, this is the old Boston Post Road as it leaves Allenton and would head across the way to go past the Silver Spring Mill and on up what now Pendar Road to head down south towards its eventual ending in New York City, when that's the kind of road that we had here. So Allenton is a great place. It has a great story to tell us, and there's an awful lot more history here than a lot of people realize, because it's gone from being a vital place once all the mill's down to kind of where it began, a quiet little intersections in the road that people don't really know the story of. So it's great. That's one of the great things about doing this 350th anniversary celebration and focusing on all these villages, to bring them back to life to people so they can begin to understand how important these places were to the community at a certain time and how interesting they still are to us. So thanks for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have them. Or yes.
For your Elm Grove talk, where are you going to be meeting?
We'll actually be meeting at the southernmost entryway, right at the Cranston plot. Part of my childhood life is, we'll talk about it there. And it's on 26th, I believe, a Saturday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we'll just go through the old section of Elm Grove. Remarkable stories there. Remarkable. And if you go, you're going to enjoy it. It's just something else.
Tim, did you talk about the significance of the Northup House in the corner of Panaquatucket in Featherbed?
Oh yeah, that, as we talked a little bit about that in regards that all of that area there, Featherbed, was run at that point by the Sanfords, and that Northup House there was predated that textile mill. That's a very early house with history that goes back to the 1690s. And the Northups were a major landowner in the beginning of the 1700s. And indeed, we'll talk about this story at the Elm Grove talk, because all the Northups were moved over there, including the Northup slaves. And the interesting part about those Northup slaves is, is anybody familiar with the movie 12 Years a Slave that came out about 15 years ago? That gentleman in that story, his father was a slave right there on Featherbed Lane. I mean, it's that intimate a connection between the story of Solomon Northup, a man who had a horrible experience, a free black man born free, who was an educated musician, he was not alone. You know, black men who traveled near the border of the Confederacy risked being captured by people and hauled across the Mason-Dixon line and sold into slavery. And it's this remarkable story, and the very beginnings of that story all occurred right there at that home. And it's quite a building. It's wonderful how it's been restored over the years. But the core of that is a house that dates to 1690, which is in the handful of the oldest buildings in North Kingstown.
Well, I don't have a question, but I want to tell you I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I lived in Allenton, was raised in Allenton. We lived across the road from the Isaac Holmes Hall.
Yep.
Went to the church in Allenton. Went to school, which was in 4 rooms, 4th grade. and went to Lafayette stores many, many times, but I love Oscar and Apple Lafayette.
Sure.
And they were just great, and Peter Zerafinitis, we used to go there sometimes, and have several relatives buried in Elm Grove. Matter of fact, we were there yesterday, but I really enjoyed the presentation.
Yep. Peter's daughter, Bess Zerafinitis, she was my first love, I tell you. I had a crush on her like nobody's business. Bess Zerafinitis, but she was smarter than that, and she so that Cranston kid's trouble. But yeah, it's just it's a great place, and there's so many great stories there, and it's sad because Allenton is kind of, people don't think about it anymore, but it has some great stories, and there's still a lot of people floating around who have pictures of Allenton, olden days. I don't know if it was still running when you were in the village, but it was
a lot of pictures of Allenton. I just posted a couple on Facebook.
I mean, it's just, it was just
we always lived in a house that's no longer there.
It was a great event, and as I said, because of the history of these mills, you wouldn't think this little village would have that attraction, but literally hundreds of people would come to Allenton because they had connections to working. It was really something.
You showed pictures of the Lafayette General Store. That back section, the far back one, has been removed. It was just too far gone to save. However, the good news is that the new owner of that building intends to do on the first floor what it originally was, which is a general store, and that's what she wants to do.
It's going to be great. It's just so wonderful to see it coming back to life, and I really hope that she's able to make it work, because it's a landmark building. It really is. And as I said, there could have been so many things that went wrong with a complicated legal process, like getting literally hundreds of Lafanieres to sign off on this thing. But they all did, because they all cared about this building so much.
56 in the end.
Excuse me?
There were 56 in the end.
56, there you go. It's a lot of Lafanieres that had to say yes, and it's just wonderful that it worked out that way, because we're all looking forward to seeing that building come back to life. And they ought to get one of those old soda machines if they're going to get it. If they're going to have a general store, I want that soda machine back.
The baby chicks were bad.
All right, well, everybody enjoy your evening. I appreciate it. Oh, you have a question? Yes.
As I look through this, I look at the history and I look at Whitford today. I wonder where the minorities are. I know you've done books on you there also.
Right.
And I look at the school, I'm seeing not a minority.
No, you're correct.
And I'm looking at the names Taylor and Sanford, but when we first moved here to South Town, it was in South Kingstown. I put the first house which was Stony Fort Road. Taylor's and Sanford's and Hazards. I mean, those were all names that I know historically, the original name of Rhode Island was Plantation. So to me, it's like, whoa, this is a connection.
Oh, you're
so
absolutely
the
right.
history that is written, that is told, is always the opposite history of those that did the background work, that did the historical building.
I've been spending
the
my
backbone. It's like, whoa, it sparks an interest in me.
I've
But
been
it's
spending
like,
a lot of time researching that. It's an important part of the story.
The pictures that were kept.
Yeah.
Where are the pictures? I mean, it may have been families that kept individual pictures, but
Right.
where are they in the libraries? Where are they?
Yeah.
So that we can see them in conjunction with.
Yeah.
There were schools. We have no children taught. You know, and we know the Narragansetts were funneled out of here. They did a lot of the stonework that you see. These beautiful stonework.
I'm sure. Yeah, it's a sad part of the story that it's
It
lost.
brings me sadness sometimes, even though I'm looking at it, because I know this is history. But I realize how much is not been brought forward to the next generation. We as older people are aware of taking it all in, but the younger people, we don't hear it so much.
I've worked now for the last decade or so with a really great teacher at the high school, Chris Carty, who has developed a Rhode Island history course. It's an
Brown
elective course.
University had to do it for Providence.
Yeah.
But and occasionally the teachers all in Rhode Island had to be aware of the curriculum. But I don't think it's being taught.
No, I think
in
a lot of
any manner around here at least.
Well, the high school is teaching it pretty
Well,
well.
I mean, even with the younger grades.
Yeah, they should teach it more.
What
A lot of
the
schools,
foundation is.
a lot of schools pay lip service to it. It's a darn
It's
shame.
sad. To me, it's sad.
Yeah, it is. It's
Because
very
we're all
sad.
one. And this is why this community and all the communities in Rhode Island exist as they are today.
Yeah.
is because of what happened prior.
No, absolutely.
It's
Rhode
not
Island's
about
story,
history.
Rhode Island's story with
Yeah.
people of color
It's
is
a rich history.
complicated and very rich, yes.
It's a rich history.
But it's something that everybody needs to understand. I agree with you 1,000%.
Just-
I did write I don't know if you've seen the book I put
Yeah, I've read, I have all of them.
Yeah, so it's important. It's an important story. Absolutely. All right, everybody, have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.